Good afternoon, everybody. Today it's Tuesday, and you know what that means, close of business. We've got a really special guest that we've been looking to have on the show for a while because he's going to talk about a lot of things that are on all of our minds. I'm talking about Csorba. Les is with Heidrick & Struggles. He's a partner there, and he's part of their CEO and board of directors practice. So for energy companies, he is finding board members, new CEOs, really the senior-most executives and leaders of energy companies today. As part of that, Les ends up writing a lot of articles. You've probably seen him in Oil and Gas Investor, the Wall Street Journal, etc. He's very familiar with the intellectual body of knowledge around corporate governance and the philosophies that we're all talking about today. And we all know why it's so important. So let me just first of all say, Les, we're delighted to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Maynard. Great to be with you.
All right. Well, let's see, Les, as you get your corporate governance muscles stretched. Let's see, Mike Bradley, tell us what's happening on the screen. I've been noticing some green numbers today. I think OPEC was doing pretty well, but you tell us what's happening.
Yeah, Maynard, it's really kind of St. Patrick's green today, like everything is green today. And the reason why is the OPEC meeting just concluded earlier today, and I think expectations were that OPEC was going to raise production 700,000 this month and 840,000 in July. And so that was said. What wasn't said is discussions of what they're going to do post the July production increases. And, if you recall, the last, the original deal they had was to increase production by about 2.4 million barrels. The July increase will get in there, and then they'll sit pat until early next year. And right now, something we've been talking about is in Q4, you're going to have a market that's potentially 2 to 2.5 million barrels undersupplied. And so we're now at, inventory levels that are nearing 5-year averages. And so the market is going to need that crude. And one of the reasons, the market is very happy today is they're not laying out what they're going to do over the next 3, 4, 5 months because they want to see what happens with Iran. They want to see what happens with the Iranian deal and see how they might have to accommodate those barrels. And so even if Iran miraculously comes back to market in, say, August, September, or somewhere in that range with 1 million barrels of production, you're still going to need 1 million barrels of production from OPEC as well. And so there's room to accommodate. And so something that we've been talking about for a while is that we didn't see that crude oil was going to plunge from here on an Iranian deal. We saw more of crude is probably going to have a little bit of a top to it. And I think that's what the market's gravitating to right now. So you have the XOP today is eclipsed March levels. You had the XLE is getting close to March levels. You had crude breaking through March levels. And so what's going on here now, you not only have, long onlys are coming into the group, and if you look at the XOP today, really, really good trading volumes in the XOP. So it's not a short squeeze. It's real money coming in because some of that uncertainty has been relieved here. So, the last time we had crude at these levels was sort of Q3 of 2018. And back then, the XOP was 40 to 45% higher at those crude levels. So one of the things we've been talking about has been a great move in the E&Ps, a great move in energy, but we think there's more to go. And so that's what the market's dealing with. Now, I must say that we are getting technically a little bit overbought with crude oil and energy equities. But the one thing we've been saying for a long time is energy is still underinvested. There's still more long money to come into the group, and we think that's going to occur. And I think it's going to occur once we find out what happens with the Iranian barrels. Once those barrels start to hit the market, once investors see that crude's not going to crash, I think you're going to see long-only money really step back into the group because of the capital discipline message they've been sending and the return of cash flow message that's been occurring. So that's a good thing, and that's why the screen is green, and it's probably going to continue to stay that way for quite a bit of time.
All right. Well, that's great, Mike. Colin, we were commenting you're taking the COBT, sartorial excellence to a whole new level. We're all intimidated. I hope we don't have to follow suit, so to speak.
No need. It's summer, right?
What's on your mind today?
Well, Memorial Day marks the start of the summer driving season. And as we, go through this period in the United States, we notice that prompt CBOT ethanol prices are knocking on the door of $2.50 per gallon for the first time since April 2014, a 7-year high. Now, the move in ethanol futures to the upside was presaged by a huge run-up in ethanol RINs prices, in fact, across all the various biofuel RINs. For example, D3, which is the cellulosic ethanol price, including RNG in that RIN market, is at $3.17 per gallon. That's 90% of the way to the permissible $3.50 high. The current year vintage non-cellulosic ethanol RIN, which is the D6 credit, is at $1.84 per gallon. That's 92% of the max $2. And just to put that in context, back in March 2020, when we went into the COVID lockdown period, the trough was at 15 cents per gallon. So we're seeing 10x kind of moves in some of these RIN prices. Now, the context for that is that both corn and gasoline prices are in motion. For example, the CBOT corn price in the prompt market hit $7.75 per bushel on May 7th. That's the highest since October 2012. The April 2020 low was at $3, and that was the lowest since September 2009. The driver of what's giving us this rally in corn prices is a disappointing harvest, at least one projected for the upcoming autumn. And the prompt RBOB price breached $2.20 per gallon today. That last happened on May 10th, and before that, we had to go all the way back to May 2018, 3 years ago. So it begs the question, are we seeing the RIN prices moving because of the weak supply in the corn market, or are we seeing it as a demand pull coming from the gasoline market? So we ran a correlation analysis on the rolling prompt prices of Chicago ethanol, Chicago corn, NYMEX RBOB futures, and the study uncovered evidence of cost push price pressures from corn into ethanol, peaking about 4 to 6 weeks ago. But the study also indicates that the current impulse in ethanol price is more of a demand pull from the end-use gasoline markets rather than a cost push coming from the corn harvest. And that foots with the latest EIA data on gasoline demand. In the May 21 week, U.S. gasoline demand is reported at 9.479 million barrels per day. That's the highest since March 13th, 2020, which is the same week when we saw the beginning of the closures of the borders. Looking at the daily log changes in the rolling trading month windows, the current correlation between ethanol and RBOB is 0.24, and between ethanol and corn, the correlation is 0.07. And when we take a step back and we look at the rolling quarterly correlation, it's 0.27 for RBOB and 0.14 for corn. So the punchline is this really does look like we're seeing a rotation in demand. And as the summer driving season comes up, the demand should be supportive. And then, just two other points of context. Let's not forget that on Friday, we learned that the PCE measure in the United States, personal consumption expenditure, was yet the latest to show a very sharp impulse, not just year over year, but sequentially. Recall that this is the number one statistic that the Fed looks at to measure inflation, particularly in that core metric within PCE. The PCE price index was 0.7% month on month. The advance that was expected was 0.6, so it beat the expectations. And the core PCE measure is now 3.06% year over year from 1.94 in March. So there is absolutely no doubt that inflation is here. The question is whether it is durable or transitory. And that's part of the reason we lead with what's happening in the RINs market, ethanol, and then into gasoline, because that would suggest it really is the economy pulling up the demand side. And then finally, you probably saw that JBS, the world's largest meat processor, suffered a cyber attack over the weekend. It's reminiscent of what happened to the Colonial Pipeline just a few weeks ago. The cyber attack forced operations offline in the United States, Canada, and Australia. And JBS controls about 20% of the slaughtering capacity in the United States. So, we saw an immediate response in the cattle futures markets. Feeder cattle futures in Chicago were limit down today. And even in the live cattle futures market, we saw a 5-cent move to the downside with LC1 falling through its 200-day. So, what's the impact of that? Well, obviously, if we have an interruption in the cattle supply chain, that could wind its way all the way back to corn demand. as the timing and volume of corn demand is put somewhat at risk. But given the correlation analysis that we ran, showing that the gasoline price is more supportive of what's happening in biofuels as opposed to the cost push from corn, unless this meat processing outage goes on a lot longer than we expect, we would expect to see gasoline prices remain intact.
So, Colin, don't you think it's interesting that so much of this inflation debate is we're talking about what's happening now, but yet there are signs that the economy is maybe really about to move. And so it feels like we have inflation now, and we haven't even really started moving yet. It just feels like the outlook, the current weather is inflation, and the future outlook is for more. Is that fair?
A couple of, maybe just two quick points on that. The first is you've seen a number of news articles that opine that we get the inflation print, but we don't see a movement in yields. And that's a very telling, myopic kind of perspective, that somehow inflation happens on a Tuesday and that, they're all supposed to react, and then by 5 o'clock, we all go home. Inflation, properly defined, is a regime. It takes a long time. It has these ebbs and these flows. And so the first point I would make is you're seeing a macro phenomenon try to be squished into an interval of time that makes no sense for what that phenomenon describes. So you have to be looking at it more over quarters, even years. In fact, fixed income regimes tend to last 40 to 60 years on average and have all sorts of ebbs and flows in them. That's point one. Point two is, I've really sort of detected and been somewhat surprised by this, that when we say inflation in the macro community, we mean something pretty specific about that. And if we had 4 or 5% inflation, all the alarm bells would be, ringing. And when I see friends who are portfolio managers in the technology space in particular, they're so programmed to see deflation through all of the productivity gains that when they use that word inflation, they usually mean hyperinflation. And so it just sounds absolutely absurd to them that we're going to have some sort of Weimar Republic inflation environment. And I think that disconnect is something that's really important to keep in mind, because inflation is able to be durable precisely because it doesn't kill the economy, because it is incremental. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind as we try to evaluate what commodity markets are trying to teach us in the near term.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, guys. And let me jump to Les. Les, again, welcome. It's really very fun for us to have you. And, as you think about this, you at Heidrick & Struggles, you get to see so much of what is happening in the world and how companies are responding to things and how they're trying to find talent. I failed to mention in your bio, you even were working for George H.W. Bush and his administration, helping him think about talent. So you've been thinking about talent for a long time. So we're all excited to hear how energy companies are thinking, how your practice is evolving, just what you guys are seeing. So let me get out of the way, welcome you, and just tee it up to tell us about what's going on.
Yeah, and it's great to be with you on a day when, WTI is pushing $70, and, there's a ton of activity going on in the space. This is a really interesting time. And of course, there's a bit of a governance crisis in the energy boardroom today. So there's a tremendous demand for new directors, a specific or a certain type of director, and certainly a different style of director. So that's what we're seeing across the energy boardroom today.
And how much of your practice, maybe let's just orient us. I know Heidrick, you guys do so much, but how much work are you guys doing? How big is the team? Just give a feel for the volume.
Yeah, so our practice in energy is global, of course. We're in every major petro center on the planet. We're in Houston, obviously, in Calgary, in Perth, Dubai, London. So we've got a great team worldwide. Most of our work is CEO and board succession. I would say probably 2/3 of that work is really board refreshment, board succession today. There's still some CEO work going on, whether it's an internal promotion or an external hire. So, and our work covers the entire value chain in energy. So we have upstream midstream, downstream services, chemicals. We have obviously a very growing, burgeoning energy transition renewable practice as well.
And I know there must be so many different needs people are looking to fill, but maybe we could start with that last one, energy transition. So you have classic companies looking to broaden out the expertise on their boards. You have these new companies looking to fill theirs and maybe draw on a little bit of classic energy. Like what's the energy transition driven board need you're seeing?
Well, I mean, for traditional, oil and gas companies, I would say, particularly the U.S. companies are focused more on, obviously, carbon capture, storage and sequestration, hydrogen, not so much renewables. Certainly the European companies, of course, are a little bit more upfront in shifting capital from E&P to renewables. So it really depends on the type of board. But I would say that for most traditional E&P companies, they certainly want an ESG perspective, an energy transition perspective on the board, because every single company has to navigate this issue and they have to think about their approach strategically from the boardroom level.
So do you find yourself less looking for, you may say all of the above when I ask you this, but, technical experts, like let's find a hydrogen, a scientist who's very familiar with hydrogen, or policy people, or environmental people, or what are the flavors in which people try to fill this energy transition role?
Well, I think if you start at the top with the super majors, I would say the focus is to find someone who's a climatologist or somebody that has deep expertise in earth sciences, atmospheric science, to bring that perspective. Now, obviously, in addition to that perspective, hopefully they have strong business acumen and a strategic understanding of the business, because you certainly don't want a one-dimensional board member who's a specialist and can't contribute to other parts of the conversation in the boardroom. So I think for the E&P companies and maybe the other smaller cap companies, they're not necessarily looking for that expertise, but somebody that maybe has some experience from another industry or business that has a strong progressive track record on ESG, and they therefore can advertise that fact from their boardroom with the proxy advisory firms. I would say that the ESG rating is becoming an additional check mark when proxy firms and large investment institutions look at boards to determine, whether they're going to invest or not.
So ESG, we sometimes say on COBT, you can't have an episode of our show without talking about ESG. But are there ways in which what's the current? Because I think we all have a generic understanding of ESG, but then it's probably getting a lot more specific when it comes to boards, like what is really necessary, what really is the kind of thing that the various outside groups want you to have. Can you kind of update our definition, if you will?
Yeah, so obviously every energy company, particularly the E&P companies, are going to have to focus on each element of ESG. Obviously, the E is the environmental piece, so that's a focus on reducing their carbon footprint, GHG emissions, flaring, methane intensity, and having real programs, whether it's big data or AI, to monitor those emissions, whether they're actually tying executive compensation to progress that they're making with respect to those emissions. So that's the E side. Every company is going to get a score with respect to E. And then on the S side, obviously the social component, I actually think the energy business does pretty well on the S side, very involved in the community as corporate citizens. I think where they may lag behind, of course, and need to focus is on the E and the G. The G, of course, deals with governance, board and committee succession, engaging in real rigorous 360 board reviews as opposed to the check the box kind of things. And then again, rigorous executive compensation tied to real emission or environmental results or targets.
Is there anything interesting going on, Les, with director compensation? Is that changing,
Yes.
getting tied to certain things? What's going on there?
Yeah, I would say that there's a definite shift from cash to equity. The large institutions, I'd say even the proxy advisory firms and certainly the activists are demanding that directors have a greater ownership interest or stake in the business so that they're better aligned to results. So we're definitely seeing a shift more towards directors actually owning more stock, less cash.
And when you mentioned a director sort of 360 degree, analysis of, unpack that a little bit for us. Do you mean evaluations of individual directors and how they're how they're doing in their job?
Yes, absolutely. So typically, a corporate board will do an annual board effectiveness study, but these typically are just surveys they pass around the room, or a law firm would come in and do a survey or a check the box exercise. What I'm suggesting is that process is becoming much more rigorous. We're actually doing that work for many companies where we actually go in and do an assessment, not only of individual directors, but an assessment of the board as a whole. And we not only interview the directors, but also the executive team, the ones that they're interacting with on a regular basis, and presenting that board review and sharing it with the board with recommendations on how they can improve their governance is actually, it can be beneficial for a company to release in a proxy or in an 8K. And it's actually getting quite a bit of positive support from some of the proxy advisory firms and large institutions who are looking closely at these boards.
And so that exercise right there, Les, do you find that is that really being used to make directors better? Like if I'm a director, somebody pulls me aside and says, people like it when you do this, they don't like it when you do this, they wish you would do more of this, Is that the type of, is it really making boards better, or is it one of these things that's like, I'm glad you're doing it and it's more thorough?
I mean, look, I think anytime you have more accountability, anytime you have a little bit more sunshine, it's always going to be helpful. I will say, Maynard, one area that has always been an issue and concern on my mind is, boards in the energy sector, particularly during the shale renaissance, I think we're probably perhaps a bit too deferential to CEOs and management teams. And so I would say one of the findings that we're certainly discovering through the board reviews is that boards realize they need to lean in a little bit more and take the oversight responsibility a little more seriously. That's coming through some of these board reviews.
So Les, are there particular issues? I think we, through the years, we're all familiar with, maybe having a different chairman and CEO. Staggered boards has always been something that comes up. Like what are the issues that people are talking about today that are that are front of mind when it comes to boards and what all these outside groups are asking and wanting?
Well, needless to say, and I'm sure you're familiar with the great demand right now for diversity, ethnic and gender diversity. I would say the major emphasis over the last year certainly has been the demand for ethnic diversity on boards. That followed a period of time where gender diversity was a major push. I would say that there's been a strong move to apply age limits. I think over half the Fortune 1000 now have age limits on their boards. Typically that's 72, but we've noticed that number is inching upwards to 74 and 75. But nonetheless, that's creating turnover. It's creating board refreshment. I would also say with respect to chairman and CEO, certainly a trend towards splitting the two titles. There are still several companies that obviously have a chairman and a CEO, but good governance, at least from the activists and certainly the proxy advisory firms, are suggesting that those two roles should be split.
Les, worldwide, we've seen courts and activists suggest that it's the job of the board to get management to cut production of oil and gas. Yeah. How do you think about, some of those pressures? Obviously, we won't talk about any specific firms, but just that general concept that it's the job of the board to implement a strategy of the company and direct management.
Yeah. Look, I think strategy typically, it depends on the company, but obviously the CEO and the team develop the strategy, obviously in consultation and collaboration with the board. I think there's definitely a shift where we see boards engaged a little bit more in strategy. I wouldn't say operations, right? They still truly understand their roles as overseers and providing strong oversight and not getting involved in the weeds of operations. But Colin, you make an interesting point. I think we're going to see boards become a little bit more active because of the recent events, certainly last week. It'll be interesting, to your point about just the whole commodity landscape. I have a theory that if the major producers and large independents have to cut back on capital for E&P production, that's going to have an impact on supply. So it actually have a bullish impact on prices, but of course that's a regressive tax for low-income users of energy. And interestingly enough, if the desire is to continue to decarbonize, it'll be the Chinese and the Russians and others who will pick up the slack, and we know their track record on emissions is horrible. They're still building coal plants in China and so forth. So there are some unintended consequences of some of the events that occurred over the last week.
Agreed. And, one of the follow-ups I would have on that is the other way to get your net emissions down is to go the whole natural solutions route and just spend a lot of money to buy credits, including the ones I just mentioned. And you can have the same absolute emissions, and now you just have an inflationary impulse coming through, markets most people have never heard of. The distinction between a D3 and a D6 credit, you cannot persuade me, is well known by the person in the street.
That's right.
Les, one term you used, refreshment. And refreshment is kind of an interesting concept, which is, I want you to explain, the latest interpretation, but, turning over the board or perhaps not being on the board for too long, how does that resonate today? Is that increasingly something people are focused on?
Yeah, I would say refreshment is the key phrase. That's when boards take advantage of, looking out at the horizon 2, 3, 4 years, anticipating retirements because of age limits. And if they don't have an age limit, actually forcing a retirement. And so it allows the board the opportunity to refresh the board with these skill sets that are required. Obviously, we talked about the ethnic and gender diversity piece, but I think there's a certain style of director that is in great demand. This director that's a little bit more engaged in oversight, perhaps less deferential to CEOs and management. Warren Buffett once said that, we need more Doberman Pinschers and fewer Cocker Spaniels on these boards. And so that's all part of the refreshment process. When we started doing this work a decade or so ago, when I was getting involved in board work, you would do a board search. So you'd have a retirement or a resignation and you'd do one board search. Today, it's evolved to what we call board succession and refreshment, where you're looking out 3, 4, 5 years down the road and really thinking strategically about how to build the right skills on these boards.
And sort of what is the supply, if you will, of candidates? I remember when Sarbanes-Oxley first hit, and we've gone through periods where people find it more or less desirable to be a board member. What's the willingness? What's the availability of candidates? How hard is it to talk people into doing it? What does that feel like to you?
Yeah, I would say, there's always been a fairly long list of highly qualified executives, retired executives who seek to serve on a board. But I would say in certainly the last 2-3 years, there's more hesitancy and certainly more rigorous vetting on their part. Long gone are the days that you could serve on 4, 5, 6, 7 boards. Remember, Vernon Jordan used to serve on 12 boards. I think 3 is probably the max today, as proxy advisory firms and investors expect 100% attendance. You've got to be engaged. You can't have any other board conflicts in terms of schedules. And then, of course, if you serve on the comp committee or audit committee and you chair those committees, you can expect to have twice the number of meetings, maybe even more than that. So to your point, we have to develop a new generation of directors in the oil and gas boardroom. As the old guard kind of starts to retire and roll off, we've got to dig in and invest in a new generation.
So, one thing about this, Les, is you listen to it and, we're diversifying boards and we're refreshing them and we're doing a lot of things that you listen to it and you say, okay, well, that's making these boards better. But then there's another part of it where it seems like the company is losing its ability to decide what would make its board better because outside forces are saying, no, we know what will make your board better than you. So what's the tug of war here? How much are we making boards better versus making boards just more like what outside forces really want them to look like?
Yeah, that's really an interesting question. I would say we've definitely seen a shift, Maynard, from CEOs selecting their own boards. I mean, we could all talk for hours about the Enron case study, right? And how disengaged that board was. Certainly that's one extreme. The other extreme would be, activists and large institutions picking their own boards. What we would advise and do advise companies is it should be a collaborative effort. The chairman and CEO should be involved, obviously, in identifying the ideal profile, certainly the cultural chemistry and the qualities of each director, because this is a small, dynamic, consensus-oriented body, and there needs to be a good culture fit. And then, of course, we need the strategic perspective of the CEO to guide board selection. But ultimately, good governance is the selection of directors. The refreshment of boards resides with the chair of nomination and governance, and it's ultimately a board decision.
Les, this is more of a philosophical question. So we've talked a little bit about an age limit on the upper end, but we haven't talked about an age limit on the lower end. And we've seen, particularly with the climate conversation, this notion that teenagers, have opinions and are the inheritors of the earth and should be stakeholders and part of the conversation. How do you think about balancing what could be, fresh blood with, we all know you got to have some experience to be able to sit in that seat and to do it properly. So is there a lower boundary to the age question? Yeah,
that's such a great question, Colin. We often find that a number of our board clients actually want generational diversity. So they are specifically looking for that generational perspective, particularly as it relates to technology and social media. I wouldn't answer your question by putting a number because it's all sort of relative. I think you need a threshold level of skills to serve on a board. I mean, you're making large capital allocation decisions, strategic decisions. So typically, when we think about generational diversity, we like to see at least some business experience, perhaps some P&L and operating experience. That doesn't mean they have to be a CEO. And as you know, it probably takes, 10, 15, 20 years to develop that, business acumen and strategic acumen and frankly, credibility to step into a boardroom. So we've certainly seen directors in their 40s, late 40s, maybe early 50s step up and certainly be represented as, generational diversity.
So Les, you were touching on this just before, but when I'll say, what is the typical case when a company is searching for a board member, who is the decision maker on, okay, we've got one? Is it a committee of the CEO, the chairman, and maybe the lead director, or what's the typical sort of approval process for a new board member these days?
Yeah, so you would certainly work directly with the nominating and governance committee, typically a 3 or 4 person board. The chair of that committee is driving the process, but before you even get started, Maynard, certainly want to consult with the CEO and the chairman if it's a person holds both those titles, and then the long list review, getting to a short list review, and the vetting of candidates really resides in that committee of nominating and governance on each board. And then, of course, they make a recommendation to the full board, and the full board would vote on electing that new director once all the vetting is completed.
And if you had a crystal ball, looks like Mike's going to jump in here too, but if you had a crystal ball, Les, thinking about boards, what they looked like 5 years ago, what they're looking like now, and you try to think 5 years plus out, like what could change about corporate governance thinking, just dynamics, size of board? I mean, what trend do you see that could make boards look a little different 5 years out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally optimistic that the quality of boards, particularly in the sector that we follow more closely, which is obviously the energy sector, I feel like boards are becoming stronger, deeper skill sets, much more rigorous in providing oversight. My one worry and fear is because of the demand for all the, from all these external groups, advisory firms, activists, et cetera, investment firms, large institutions, these boards could get pretty large because they're asking for a lot of different skill sets. I mean, if you think about some of the risks in our business, I mean, if we just looked at the Colonial Pipeline situation, now, we've always had a strong desire for cybersecurity expertise on boards and technology experience. If you layer that onto, obviously, the demand for diversity and all these other skill sets, you could get boards that are pretty large, and then they become somewhat ineffective. And so that's the one fear that I have. I think boards are really going to have to think through that process and come up with the right size and to be effective.
Hey, Les, I'm pretty interested in, obviously Exxon is bringing a couple new board members on here. And I just want to get a sense from you if, we've seen activists involved in the space before, been able to get, directors onto the board. What's been the change in culture at those firms once those guys are accepted? Has there been a battle within the management team that said, we didn't really want you guys here, now you're being forced upon us? And has there been any real tangible measure you can look at to say that's been a successful tactic, in exploiting, gains, or maybe it's changed the culture, whatever the case may be? Everyone looks at it as this is a good thing as opposed to maybe it's not such a great thing. What's been your experience that you can tell us?
Obviously I can't speak to any specific situation, but I can speak generally. I actually think over the last decade or so, the right relationship with an active investor can be a very healthy and beneficial process. I can certainly talk about one historical case. Obviously, years ago, Elliott got involved in Hess, and I'm sure you all followed that case. I think most objective observers would say that was a pretty healthy process that actually helped and benefited the company, just in terms of their performance today. Quite a significant turnaround. And you could directly attribute that to changes in the boardroom back, almost 10 years ago. So I think that obviously every board in our sector needs to have a strategy on how they are going to work with an activist, because let's face it, it's the new it's the new era, right? The barbarians are inside the gates, and we've got to think creatively of how to work cooperatively and diplomatically with some of these investors, and think of the best partnership to serve the shareholder. So I don't know if that's helpful, Michael.
One question for you, Les. I know we're going to lose you here in just a little bit, but international boards. I'm always struck by in this ESG conversation, and I forget we had a guest on one time, and we were talking about Chinese companies and their ESG ratings, and the question kind of became, well, they're making solar panels, so of course they have a good rating. But it was like, well, wait a minute. What about their board? What about their decision making? What about their E, S, and G as it relates to the production of these types of products? Or what's going on in the international arena around ESG and boards?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on the Chinese situation other than to obviously think of the irony, right? Because they're building massive coal plants to power up the manufacture of solar panels, which is interesting. But I think in Europe, certainly Europe has been, I would say, a bit of a forerunner on some of these issues and separating chairman and CEO. There are specific term limits around governance. The one thing that obviously I think concerns those of us who come from a different tradition in America, right? There's sort of this revulsion to the idea of quotas. We believe in competence, not quotas. Now, diversity is important and we should be promoting diversity. But when you actually have to start filling quotas, it's actually very, very patronizing and demeaning to ethnic and gender diverse directors to feel like they're just part of a quota. So that is kind of a European, I would say, tradition that I don't think is, on the extremes, of course, in California and Illinois, there are some quotas here and there, but I really don't feel like that's, what I personally feel like we should be moving towards, because I think it actually is counterproductive and demeaning and patronizing to some outstanding, highly qualified, diverse and ethnically diverse, gender diverse candidates.
Well, Les, you've been really generous with your time. We really appreciate it. I guess as we wrap up, it sounds like you're pretty optimistic that we're making some better, more resilient companies with better governance, and they're getting the skills they need to manage through a lot of the uncertainty that's to come. But I'm leading the witness, but I think that's the impression you're giving.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. I mean, obviously, I've been in this space for a long time, and I would say over the last 3-4 years, there's been a ton of, and it frequently doesn't get talked about. I mean, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and other publications aren't talking about some of the real reforms that have taken place in the energy business around governance. And I see it, and it's significant. And actually, I think it's starting to show up in the results. We talked about this capital discipline. We talked about the focus on free cash flow. We see the investment in technology to monitor emissions, real commitments on, reducing GHG emissions and new technologies in the industry to reduce and perhaps even eliminate flaring. So a lot of really good news that doesn't get talked about. And I see it, and I know you see it. And that's why I'm optimistic about sort of the general direction of governance and energy.
One last thought: as you go and recruit, let's say, technology people or diversity candidates who are outside of the industry. I'm just thinking, but generally speaking, go on the talent search.
Right.
Outside of energy.
Right.
For people who bring things that will help make us better. Are you finding the attitude of, well, sure, I'll be on an oil and gas board. I'm happy to do that. Or do you find resistance? Like, I worry sometimes we get painted. People don't appreciate what the industry's doing, and as a result, you get people who are reluctant to be a part of it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've had some interesting experiences, as you can imagine, from director candidates literally hang up the phone. They don't want to talk about serving on an oil and gas board, to those that perhaps are from ancillary industries, broad industrials, manufacturing, who understand that we need reliable, plentiful, and cheap energy. And that's part of our job, Maynard. I mean, and that's what makes it fun for me, because I get to talk about the moral benefit of what this industry has done to humanity, right? And the fact that the COVID-19 miracle vaccine would not have been possible without reliable oil and gas, right? You talk about the plastics and the vials and the supply chain system to make the vaccine possible. That's because of the industry, the oil and gas industry, not intermittent solar and wind. And so it's fun to talk about these issues and be an advocate and try to recruit prospective directors from other industries to the energy business.
Well, awesome. That's a great place to wrap up. Les, we really appreciate it. It's got us all fired up over here. And thanks for all the good work you're doing, making energy better. We appreciate it.
Thanks. Enjoyed being with you, Maynard and Colin. Michael, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah. Thanks, Les.
Bye-bye.